This is Drew, Sierra, Alex, and Emma. We all chose to do a study for behavior on tidal influences on Sanderlings' foraging behavior. Sanderlings are these little birds that go along the beach, and we chose to observe their foraging behavior compared to when there was tide, so whether it was low tide or high tide, and how they reacted to those tides. For our objectives during the procedure, what we decided to follow along to figure out were we wanted to determine if the tides had any influence on the Sanderlings' behavior, whether they were bigger foragers at low tide or high tide, and whether the tide coming in or leaving had any effect on their behavior. So we determined three different waterline zones. We had in water, on the wet sand, whereas the water line like met the wet sand, and we had dry sand. And we wanted to see which area of that water line would encourage the most foraging behavior for these sanderlings. We also established different behavior decisions for like what they were doing that we could observe and monitor. So we established if they were walking, if they were resting, if they were flying due to flushing from a predator, if they were foraging actively, if they were grooming, if they were grooming each other, or if they were probing or looking around. So those were the social interactions that we were checking out in the experiment and used to kind of follow along. That way we would all have the same data. We also wanted to see if there was any comparison to when they would forage with predators being present or absent. So those were the objectives we were observing during our research. Our hypothesis that we decided on, we believed the sanderlings would kind of forage actively along the shoreline, mainly during low tide. We thought that that would have the most amount of food, the tide would be out, they would be able to forage a lot along that sand and that water line, and that the efforts would diminish, so they would forage less as the tide came up, which pushed the beach smaller and led them closer to predators, we thought. We did expect that the foraging behavior would remain the same across the entire United States where we were all studying, but we did think that there could be some differences seen due to the amount of predators on the beach, whether that was human predators or dogs or kids or anything else. So we did expect that to change. So the animal that we chose to study is the sanderlings. They are a part of the genus Chaldreus, and their species name is Chaldreus alba. They're a little tiny bird that lives in the beach area, but they migrate quite a long ways. So they're about 7 to 8 inches in length. They've got about a 14-inch wingspan, and they only weigh about 40 to 100 grams. So they're a little tiny, plump, small bird with that nice short bill that's black and those nice long black legs that you're going to see mainly at the beach unless they're nesting. So some of the adaptations that sanderlings have to be able to survive are going to be that they have no hind toe. This allows them to run across the sand at a much faster speed to avoid predators and to get where they need to go without having to actually use the energy to fly. They also have a great camouflage color. They've got a nice white belly, but that top of their plumage is usually a blend of sandy colors, which allows them to kind of blend into the beach, making them harder to see for the predators. And they also have a rete merbial, which basically means that they can retain heat by only standing on one leg. So if they put one leg down on the ground, the other leg they will pull near their heart. It allows the blood circulation to go a little faster, and it keeps them warmer with only having that one leg down. So that's something they can do to kind of keep that body temperature up when it's cold, especially in their nesting areas. So the relevant previous studies that we had for the Sanderlings were mainly on April 2009 by Vannerman, which basically had the observed Sanderlings along the Belgian coastline. So this was the shoreline in Belgium, and he was mainly observing the foraging behavior and whether they preferred certain animals. So he was seeing if they preferred the worms that were in the sand along the beach, but he was observing that foraging behavior during that study. So we found that to be the most relevant previous study. The methods that were used were observations, prey identification, fecal analysis, and assessment of prey location, which was really interesting to us. And the results were even when the sanderlings were observed not to catch the worms, they were still predating on small crabs that washed ashore, along with insects, broken mollusk shells, and other living or recently decayed animals in that zone where they were foraging. The conclusion was that sanderlings will forage on fresh prey items on the shore following any change in the tides.
Like Drew mentioned earlier, sanderlings belong to the genus Calidris, which are in the larger family of Scolopacidae, which encompasses shorebirds like sandpipers, which the sanderling is a part of. During our observations, we mapped out the intertidal zones into three sections for behavior study. Below in the diagram are the upper intertidal, the middle intertidal, and the lower intertidal zones. At the beach that I am located, I anticipated the sanderlings to mainly stay close to the upper intertidal area due to the abundance of beachgoers, cars, and family dogs. However, during our collective observations and discussions, we found that sanderlings mostly were foraging, resting, and generally congregating in the middle to lower intertidal zones. Sometimes they were found to be in the surf zone up to their feet. However, any deeper and they would flush or fly away. Hence, this particular behavior is known as wave chasing. This behavior was apparent and noted in our collective observations. The sanderlings would chase and retreat with the constant ebb and flow of the tides, so their feeding behavior is closely tied to the tidal flow and cycles. They were also spotted foraging around larger gulls like the laughing gull. This was a little surprising as the sanderlings seemed very skittish and timid, and they are known to be prey to larger birds like raptors. However, after further research, we found that larger aquatic birds like pelicans are predatory on sanderlings, so the sanderlings looked like they didn't have much to worry about being around gulls. Overall, our research coincided with the study conclusion of Vannerman and others noted about sanderling foraging in the lower tidal zone and for the freshest prey items. The range map below is of North America and parts of South America. We learned that sanderlings are found worldwide at different times of the year. However, they are found in the Arctic tundra during nesting and breeding season. They have a long migration range. Much of this migration is accomplished in long, nonstop flights. Studies show that many individuals return year after year to the same wintering sites. During migration in winter, their habitat is sandy beaches and tidal flats along both ocean coastlines, shores of lakes and rivers, and inland wetlands. Their range is nearly entirely coastal, but they can be spotted throughout much of North America during their migration window. There are common sites on coastal beaches around the world, including the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts of North America. Sanderling predators are mainly in nesting and breeding locations. These predators include Arctic foxes, wolves, snowy owls, merlins, peregrine falcons, snakes that prey on eggs, and one I mentioned earlier, pelicans. Sanderlings will fly in a tight flock when threatened by a bird of prey like a peregrine falcon. Sanderlings are very active birds compared to other sandpipers. Their activity is a result of their hunting behavior as wave chasers. Their non-breeding diet mainly consists of crustaceans like small crabs, amphipods and isopods, mollusks, marine worms, insects, algae, and small fish. They have also been known to eat carrion, which is decaying animal flesh. They have also been observed eating horseshoe crab eggs in the spring. During their breeding nesting time, their diet mainly consists of flies, insects, spiders, seeds, berries, roots, and beach algae. Now here's Sierra to take it from here.
So I'm Sierra, and I'm going to take us through the study sites and methodology. So all four of us are located on different coasts. Emma and Drew are located on the East Coast, Alex in the Gulf of Mexico, and then I'm on the West Coast, up in Long Beach, Washington. So we all experience different climates, different temperatures, precipitation, and also slightly different habitat types. So all of us are exposed to sandy beaches. Which is why we're able to do these studies. But yeah, for the most part, coastline, varying temperatures. And then for a better visual, There's a map here. So you can see I'm all the way up here in the northern portion. Alex over here in the Gulf, Drew over here in South Carolina, and then Emma over in Fort Lauderdale. And so, for an even better visual representation, here's a little snip of each of our locations. So, we've got Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, a nice open beach, definitely frequented by visitors. We've got Fort Lauderdale, Florida, um, warmer weather, visitors, smaller beach, very pretty beach. And then Galveston, Texas, also subject to visitors, vehicles, dogs. Alex and I are locations. You're able to drive along the beach, lots of dogs off leash, and that kind of thing. And then we've got Long Beach, Washington, very large beach. As I mentioned, subject to visitors, dogs, vehicles. Um, and yeah. So for the methods, there were four of us. We each conducted four surveys, two surveys at high tide, two surveys at low tide. We collected metadata, which you can see up in this top right corner. It was good practice. We unfortunately didn't have the time to use a lot of it, but it was good practice. And then just in case, you know. And then, so for our observations, we actually used binoculars, timers, and then the voice memo app on our phones. So each bird was observed with a goal of 5 minutes each for a total of 25 minutes. So ideally, five birds for 5 minutes each, but that doesn't always happen. Some birds flush. And so some of us may have observed eight birds for a total of 25 minutes. And then sometimes it was nice to get five birds for 5 minutes each. Um, so once we had those voice memos, we would all transcribe them into a shared Excel sheet documenting the behaviors and the duration. So here's our ethogram over here. Essentially, each voice memo would look something similar to, or sound something similar to, Sanderling is foraging in the damp sand, still foraging, still foraging. Now it's walking in the damp sand, it's walking in the wet sand. And then we would transcribe that into a shared sheet. For our statistical analysis, we ran a MANOVA and ANOVAs in ArcGIS Pro's Python notebook. It was just more straightforward than using Excel to do a MANOVA. So a MANOVA is to test multiple dependent variables, and an ANOVA tests just one. So we ran the MANOVA for all of the behaviors all at once in response to tide. And then we also ran it in response to observer and location. And then we did separate ANOVAs for each of the behaviors to see if any one particular behavior had a relationship. And then similar studies actually used Mancovas and Ancovas. So these are kind of more in depth, and they kind of uh, they take into consideration covariates. So, the beach width, how many disturbances there are, temperature. So that would have been really nice to have done for our study. But unfortunately, the time constrictions, we weren't able to do it. So this was a study done with using similar data analyses, but also taking into consideration those different covariates. So I'm getting
As Sierra highlighted, we used both MANOVA and ANOVA to translate our results, and we encountered an interesting twist. Our initial hypothesis was proven incorrect. We discovered that tidal influences did not lead to a significant difference across various tide levels, revealing that both low and high tides produce similar effects on the bird's behavior. Initially, based on the hypothesis that Drew previously mentioned, we anticipated that if MANOVA findings suggested no significant difference in the data, that ANOVA would uncover more subtle variations in the behaviors. And to our surprise, the ANOVA results mirrored those of MANOVA, revealing no significant differences at all. Instead, our analysis enlightened us on the critical influence that both location and observer have on the results instead. both of which demonstrate a significant variance in the results. The p-values for all conducted tests fell below the 0.05 threshold, which basically indicated that location drastically impacts bird behaviors, not so much high and low tides. These results imply that the behavior of birds is not uniform across tidal levels, but rather fluctuates drastically depending on where observers were conducting their study. And so distinct environments such as highly trafficked beaches that include sunbathers, joggers, dogs, and cars can lead to significant variations in behaviors such as foraging, resting, and flying. This means that urban areas can have distinct challenges for the species that Alex previously reviewed with us at the beginning of the presentation. For movement and flying, they were more common in areas as the Sanderlings seem to be more alert compared to other locations. On the other hand, calmer and quieter areas, such as more remote beaches and marshes, demonstrated more and longer foraging and resting times. As you can see on the graphs to the right, all locations had high foraging duration, but resting and flying were short to almost no observations depending on the location, which could contribute to the results. And for this reason, the relationship between an animal's habitat and its behavior show how important it is to consider the environment when we study birds in the future. As for that being said, at least, we'll now review our group's discussion and conclusion, with the location observer now being the main influence of Sanderling behavior and our tidal influence were not. We believe that some of these outcomes were due to having almost too many variables, so they came into play with our study. And this was weather conditions, disturbances, times of the day, exact tidal height. All of these played a role to some degree in our results. But as Sierra previously stated, it was too difficult to control these variables and we did not have enough time or resources to help mitigate some of these factors. Other factors to consider are observer bias, meaning does one observer pick a bird with similar behaviors each time, or does one observer prefer to go to the beach at certain times of day? So low tide every morning or high tide every evening, it depends. Also, migration of the birds can come into play as well, as all locations are so far apart, and it is possible that the sanderlings are higher or lower in population levels or acting differently based on where they are and where they are in their migration, basically across the United States. A previous study conducted by Romley and Nora Zellini resulted in lower tides demonstrating for foraging, preening, mobility, where high tides reflected more roosting and resting, which was interesting to read as, again, our results did not yield similar findings. And what previous studies did align with our results include 3 other shorebird and sanderling specific studies. And what included was Murchison et al. 2016. This basically explained how predators, or in this case, people and dogs closer to the sanderlings, cause behavior disruptions in the species. In our results, the sanderlings showed more movement, such as walking or flying, when either of these disturbances were in the area compared to when they were further away. Equally, Berger and Gotchfield, 1991, and Thomas et al., 2003, they had similar results, noting 100 meters had an impact to Sanderling in Berger and Gotchfield, and 30 meters had an impact from Thomas et al. While distance was not a main factor considered for our study, it would be beneficial to consider for future studies. Also, free-running dogs have a big notable negative effect on sanderling foraging. So it triggered almost an immediate flight or walking behavior as the birds fled. And according to Murchison et al. 2016, 52% of the time, so this is 160 out of 308 occurrences, sanderlings responded in a way when people or dogs were within 100 meters, similarly supporting Berger and Gotchfield. As for future studies, limiting or expanding the location, extending observations, and having additional participants shifting to behavior changes due to predators, which are human and dogs, within the vicinity, and a moon chart with dates reflecting the influence of tide were all factors that should be prioritized. As for limit and expanding location, this is due to significant environmental differences between study locations. It's recommended to either expand the study to multiple US sites or focus on a single location. Sanderling behavior varied more than expected, mainly due to local disturbances rather than tides, with urban areas causing the most disruption. Then for extending observation and having more participants, longer observation periods and multiple observers at each site would also be beneficial, as individual sanderlings may react differently to specific variables, and one observer may not catch all the variables involved. Then there's also a shift to behavior changes due to predators within the vicinity. And as our previous slide had, this is a very big component and something that needs more evaluation on. and moon chart, just to go ahead and see, with low, high and low tide, are there any other significant differences that we need to be aware of? Last but not least is our literature science side.